Good evening, you're watching Everything Weapons. Today we're going to be discussing a very entertaining and interesting World War II commando-specific operation and mission, the Gran Sasso Raid, where the Germans rescued Mussolini, the Italian leader, who was arrested and held in Italy. It's a very interesting story, and today we're going to learn all about it. So the Gran Sasso Raid was called Operation ADVIKK, or Operation Oak. And when did this happen? September 12th of 1943, okay? So near the second half of World War II, launched around 1 to 2 p.m. local time. Entire assault phase lasted under 30 minutes on the mountain, and let's discuss why did this happen. Why did the Germans want to rescue Benito Mussolini, and why did Germany pursue the Gran Sasso Raid, an impossible operation rescue mission, right? Benito Mussolini was disposed and arrested by the Italian king and Marshal Badoglio on July 25th of 1943, after Italy's government secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies, publicly announced on September 8th. So really quick, guys, if you don't know who Benito Mussolini was, so the first arrest was in July 1943, right before the Gran Sasso Raid, and right before he was ousted and arrested by the Italian King Victor Emmanuel III. His official titles were Head of Government, Prime Minister of Italy, Secretary of State, and he was popularly styled as the Second Duce, or the leader. And his later in World War II, his second arrest and capture occurred on April of 1945, right before he was captured and executed by Italian partisans. He served as the Duce of the Italian Social Republic, a German sister state in northern Italy. Hitler ordered the rescue to restore a fascist puppet regime in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, maintain Axis alliance optics, and score a major propaganda victory. And Mussolini had been hidden in multiple locations before being moved to the isolated Hotel Campo Imperator, a former ski resort on the Gran Sasso d'Italia mountain massif, which is 2,100 meters above, or 6,900 feet in elevation, so almost 7,000 feet in elevation. And this is northeast of Rome, Gran Sasso. How did this happen? Let's discuss step by step. How did the Germans commit this very difficult and grueling task? Well, Germany and their intelligence located Mussolini via intercepted messages and aerial recon, and the plan, devised mainly by Luftwaffe Major Harald Moors with Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando leader, inserted, used a two-pronged assault for surprise. Firstly, ground convoy secured the lower cable car station at the mountain base. Second step, 10 DFS 230 gliders of 12 planned crash-landed directly on the rocky plateau beside the hotel. Troops overwhelmed the 200 Italian Carabinieri guards with minimal fighting. Many surrendered immediately due to shock and post-armistice demoralization. So perhaps the Italian troops here, because they didn't fight and surrendered so easily, many of them could have been based and supporters even secretly of Mussolini, even though they were troops outside and Mussolini was arrested, right? But Mussolini was secured by the Germans, then flown out in a Fieseler Fi-156 Storch light plane that took off downhill over a cliff. The raid succeeded despite terrible terrain and even weather risks, guys, alright? But now let's discuss how difficult and how actually hard was this operation and super specific cool commando mission. How hard was it to perform and actually execute, right? So, extremely high risk and technically demanding. One of World War II's most audacious special operations succeeded and committed and attempted by the Germans, and the landing zone looked flat in photos, but in reality was actually a very steep rock infested slope at high altitude, so thin air reduced the lift glider performance, so it wasn't a flat, easy landing zone on Sasso. Gliders had to crash land. No wheels down rollout was possible, and 2 gliders were lost on takeoff, and several were damaged on landing, and many people got injured. Many Germans got hurt in the crash landings. Pilots had to navigate precisely without powered flight after release. Most men were okay, but it was a very bumpy, scary landing that they were lucky to even survive, right? Otto Skorzeny, being the wild madman commando, very high achiever, ignored an abort order. The overloaded Storch extraction from a tiny improvised runway over a very difficult terrain was borderline suicidal, and pilot Captain Heinrich Gerlach succeeded anyway. Success relied on total surprise, with Italian reluctance to fight and flawless coordination under extreme pressure. It was not a walkover. Terrain and timing made failure, crashes, heavy casualties, or even Mussolini's death very likely. Men involved on both sides and casualty rates. This mission involved a total German strike force of roughly 100 to 110 men, and this operation was a combined effort executed by the Luftwaffe Paratroopers and the Waffen-SS Commandos. The task force was broken down into 2 primary elements. The Luftwaffe Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, the bulk of the force, approximately 76 men, were drawn from the elite Fallschirmjäger Lehr Battalion. This was the Parachute Demonstration Battalion, which was an elite unit of the German Luftwaffe during World War II. Formed in 1941, it served primarily as an experimental and instructional unit for testing new paratrooper tactics and equipment. They were led by Air Mission Commander Oberleutnant George Freiherr von Berlepsch and overall ground commander Major Harold Moores. 2 companies were tasked with securing the base and railway of the mountain, and the Waffen-SS Commandos was a small contingency of 16 hand-picked SS men attached to the operation, and they were led by SS Hauptsturmführer Otto Skorzeny, who famously pushed to join the raid for propaganda purposes and accompanied the first wave. Otto Skorzeny was eager to join this operation, and that's why he fought to join elite Special Forces German Commandos with 10 gliders times 9 to 10 men each, including the pilots in each glider, and separate ground force of about 90 to 100 paratroopers in about 20 vehicles actually secured the cable car base on the mountain, with total German commitment roughly was 200 men for the Sasso operation here. Now, let's talk about the Italian side. The Italians had approximately 200 to 250 carabinieri guards, police troops, lightly armed, not elite combat units, no commandos, at the hotel and base. So the Italians didn't have elite super soldiers guarding Mussolini, right? So that was the major thing here, was experience, right? Skorzeny had his 16 SS commandos, they had gliders, they had a decent amount of Fallschirmjäger paratroopers helping at the mountain base. That was very crucial early on in this mission. Now let's talk about how many people died, right? The casualties. They were actually shockingly extremely surprisingly low, with Germans had 0 men killed, but about 10 men wounded, mostly minor injuries from the glider crash landings, right, on the steep, rocky mountain terrain. Now, the Italians had 2 men that were killed, a few lightly wounded, but no significant firefight occurred, and most guards surrendered without resistance right away, slightly suggesting that maybe a good amount of these Italian men were German sympathetic and more aligned with them, perhaps. But I guess we'll never know. But that's my guess why it was so easy that they didn't put up a fight, right? It wasn't worth their life. So there could have been a little bit of love from the Italians for Mussolini, or the Germans even. But now let's talk about the vehicles and aircraft involved, guys. Okay, so the aircraft, airborne assault. So 10 DFS-230 assault gliders that were silent, short-fueled, capable, each carried 9 troops and a pilot, used parachute brakes and nose rockets for rough landings, towed by Henschel HS-126 or similar single-engine planes from Pratica di Mare airfield near Rome. Extraction aircraft, 1 Fieseler Fi-156 Storch, which was an ultralight takeoff, landing, reconnaissance German plane, carried Mussolini with Skorzeny, along with the pilot despite overload. Ground vehicles, about 20 trucks and German vehicles were used in this operation for the lower cable car force. Some sources note, though, supporting tanks and maybe armored cars at the mountain base for perimeter security, but we really don't know. I would like to think that the Germans were that prepared with armored cars, but that was a more difficult task, so it could have just been trucks instead of tanks and armored cars. But no U-boats, no submarines or naval elements were used in the Sasso raid, purely air-to-ground operation. Will we ever see specific missions and operations like this one involving Special Forces Commandos? Probably not, but now let's talk about why didn't the Americans conduct similar raids during World War II for high-level soldiers and pilots who were captured by the enemy that were incredibly valuable. So America's best tankers, pilots who were POWs, right? The U.S. did launch major POW rescue raids when feasibility and valuable people were captured, just like the Kapan Yutian raid in the Philippines, 1945, freed about 500 POWs. And we also did it in Vietnam on the Son Tay raid in 1970, attempted for POWs, though camp was empty. However, no Mussolini-equivalent rescue operations, single high-value political prisoner existed in an isolated raid-able spot, with U.S.-American strategy was more emphasized on mass operations, overwhelming force, numbers, and intelligence over propaganda stunts, with high-risk single-person rescues for pilots, high-level tankers, soldiers, were often deemed too costly, with logistics, potential escalation, low propaganda return compared to Germany's need to prop up a faltering ally. Captured Americans were usually in larger camps, deep in enemy territory, or just not strategically critical enough to justify the extreme risks that the H-man accepted for rescuing his buddy Mussolini. U.S. command culture prioritized saving lives through broader campaigns rather than one-off commando spectacles. But slightly later, After 1943 and 45, the Americans conducted very cool commando missions that I'll make separate videos on. So for very obvious reasons, Mussolini was extremely thankful and grateful for the Germans rescuing him, and his immediate reaction when Scorzani reached him and said, according to multiple accounts of eyewitnesses, Scorzani said, "Duce, the Führer has sent me to free you." Mussolini replied with great emotion, "I knew that my friend Adolf Hitler would not abandon me," or variations like, "I knew my friend would not forsake me." Benito reportedly hugged Scorzani when he was rescued, and contemporary accounts describe him as visibly relieved and emotional. He had been in a depressed state after his arrest by the Italian king and his own fascist Grand Council in July of 1943, and the sudden German intervention pulled him back from likely trial and or execution. So he was extremely thankful. The rescue was a dramatic lifeline. Mussolini was flown off the mountain, and he expressed immense gratitude to the H-Man. But some say the longer term, his emotions were more mixed, with Mussolini was tired, demoralized, and reluctant to return to power as a German leader for the Italian Social Republic and northern Italy, but some sources note he appeared world-weary and not overjoyed in photos, and the H-Man had to pressure him to resume leadership. So now let's talk about the weapons and guns used in this mission. So, interestingly enough, it's the operationally first time by the German paratroopers during the raid that the FG-42, or Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, was used ever in combat, and this was a selective fire battle rifle featuring an integrated bipod and spike bayonet that was specifically designed for paratroopers. They needed a smaller rifle that was able to do full auto, along with semi-automatic that was a substantial cartridge. So very cool, the first time FG-42s were being used. And of course, Kar 98K were also used. This was just the standard issue bolt-action rifle carried by several members of the assault force, along with some submachine guns like the MP-38 and iconic MP-40, the standard submachine guns heavily utilized by the raiding commandos for close quarters engagement upon landing. So MP-40s were fantastic guns also for paratroopers because they're very small, full auto, not as good range and damage as the FG-42, but still. They also had machine guns, MG-34, MG-42, general purpose MGs, some of which were mounted in the DFS-230 assault gliders or set up to secure the perimeter. Pistols were also used, obviously, the Luger P08, the standard 9mm semi-automatic service pistol carried by German officers and troops, along with paratroopers, and possibly and/or Walther P38s carried as a primary sidearm by several commandos. And they also had explosives and heavy support, like hand grenades with the Steel Handgranata. Stick grenades were used during the initial assault, along with flamethrowers, interestingly enough, employed by the commandos to specifically disable the outer defenses and radio installations of the Italian fortress. So most likely just the Flammenwerfer 35, but possibly and/or the Flammenwerfer 41, I believe, and heavy artillery and armor support, while the paratroopers and the SS commandos took the hotel by air. The broader operation under Major Otto Harold Moores utilized artillery, armored cars, and tanks at the base of the mountain to block roads and or cut off communication lines between the Italians inside the fortress and out, right? So very cool FG-42 debut. I mean, they quickly learned, the Germans, to improve the FG-42 because the second model didn't have the tilted handle grip. That's one of the easiest ways to notice that. So they did use V1 version 1 FG-42s, but they still did pretty decent. And I mean, there was no major gunfight here, so, but still, the Germans were well equipped, I guess you could say, with weapons and firearms and explosives and even armored cars. So that was a very good tactic, but there wasn't many Italian forces in this area because it was so mountainous and rural. So it wasn't like it was the heart of Italy that they were going inside of, obviously, but still, because of the high altitude and rocky terrain, it was very difficult and highly dangerous. Hopefully you guys learned something about the Gran Sasso raid conducted on September 12th of 1943. Once again, the rescue operation where the Germans saved Mussolini. Drop a like, a thumbs up is greatly appreciated, guys. It does help me out in the algorithm, okay? I know it's annoying. Subscribe. You've been watching Everything Weapons. Check out my older content on the videos. On the channel, I meant lots of old content to binge and check out. Interesting history and just weapon videos and whatnot. LARP stuff. And thank you guys so much for watching. Type us a comment down below of what you thought about the show and this episode. And if you have any other cool World War II stories, or just, it doesn't have to be the 40s only, any cool military operation or specific mission, these interest me so much, especially commando raids and operations. Very cool stuff. And clearly the Germans were very skilled here because overall it was a success, and very few people on both sides, the Italians and the Germans, were killed. So it was a crazy stunt that somehow worked. Somehow the gliders, most of them lived and survived, and even, you know, the plane Scorzini and Mussolini were on, it was a very crude, sketchy takeoff plane, right? Reconnaissance vehicle, simple plane. So that makes it even more wild and crazy, but very interesting. I love the lore. And yeah, thank you guys. See you next time.